For CEOs, I always tell them the most important thing that you can do every single day is to talk to your key players and to make sure their heads are right and they're thinking in the right direction. So if you've got 10 direct reports and it's a Monday and you're kicking off the week, checking in. Hey, just checking in quick. Take 90 seconds. It doesn't have to be a long conference call. Now, those are good to have, by the way. I'm not saying you wouldn't have routine things scheduled, but a quick check-in call. What's on your mind? Anything I can help you with? What's your direction for the day? Now, you get them focused. They're focused on the right thing. Great things happen. And if you do that with all 10 of your people, it takes 15 minutes or so, and it could be throughout the whole day on that Monday, but that's the priority.
All right, Dave, so we've been going through a few topics here that I think are pertinent for not just the entrepreneur, the business owner, but the executive, the homemaker and such. Today, we're going to dive a little bit more into a leadership principle that you talk about, which is effectively how to master delegation for maximum efficiency. In fact, I think I just heard you talking a little bit about how to, motivate a team in just 90 minutes and get them to do the things that they need to get done for maximum input. So walk us through kind of the process of delegating for maximum efficiency, if you don't mind.
Yeah, it's a good question. So what I have found is that most people spend time on irrelevant things. And they are things that don't produce any sort of outcome. And so at the end of the day, if you help them filter through the relevancy and irrelevancy of the circumstance, that's what works the best. I'll give you kind of a classic example, and we've talked about this before, but it's really worth repeating, and it's also worth looking at from a completely different angle too once we set this stage. But salespeople will quite often and by the way, entrepreneurs will do this, engineers will do this, accountants will do this, but I'm going to use a sales example. There's certain parts of their job they don't feel like doing, like making phone calls. Most people do not feel like doing that. Even high-level, high-performing salespeople generally don't like calls. Now, some people do. I consider them, like very far outliers. But most people, in the roles that they have, don't like part of it, but they do it anyway. So for example, in athletics, there's a lot of people that don't like to eat the way they need to eat or to exercise in certain ways, but they do it anyway. The salesperson doesn't like to make the phone calls, but they do it anyway. When we examine that, you have to say, well, what are you doing to distract yourself from the thing you're supposed to be doing? And we use self-justification. So the salesperson says, well, I'd like to make more phone calls, but I have all this administrative work to do. And they blow up the administrative work, which is a secondary responsibility. Anytime we basically say, I'm going to turn my primary responsibilities into secondary and my secondary into primary, we're justifying our circumstance. So, you don't feel like making phone calls, so you spend time on administration. So you don't want to just take off for the day. Now, some people do that. Instead, you're going to busy yourself with things that are easier to you, that don't take as much time, that you can hide behind and make them, last for a longer period of time. So when I would have salespeople in my organization and I would say, what does today look like? They'd say, well, I've got all this administration to do. And I set up the program so I knew that there wasn't a lot of administration. I knew exactly how much time it took. And it took about an hour and a half a week for them to do any sort of administrative work. So I'd say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, I have this, and how do you expect me to do this? And I have a deadline here. And I was like, listen, you're doing it wrong if it takes you that long. It takes 90 minutes to do. And I removed that objection from them by objectively showing them how the administration in the work, in the role is very, very tiny. But they would still use that excuse. That's the crazy thing about it, is that I developed the program. They knew that I actually at one point had followed the program, and that there were, literally about 1,000 other people in the company that had their same job that were also following the program, but they themselves would say, no, this is a unique thing for me. So they were focused on the wrong thing. So when you want to lead other people, and delegating has a lot to do with leading, you have to make sure that they know what their primary role is. And what does that look like at the end of the day? We've talked about this before, but one of the biggest concerns that people have in their work is, how am I doing? How do people perceive the role that I'm doing? Am I doing okay? Well, if you can break it down and you can say, listen, you can do these three things. If you for example, in sales, if you make this many phone calls and get this many appointments, many appointments, and you conduct these 2 other tasks throughout every single day, you're doing fantastic work. You don't even need us to tell you because you're doing fantastic work. Now, any great leader is going to recognize them, but you would know. So you give them a self-management mode. You say, if you don't accomplish these 3 things, then you won't be doing a good job. If you accomplish 2 of them, you'll be doing an okay to subpar job. If you do 1 of them, you are absolutely failing. And if you do none, well, then, you should be looking for a new job. So what are those 3 things? And it doesn't really matter what the role is. So for example, for CEOs, I'll tell them the most important thing that you can do every single day is to talk to your key players and to make sure their heads are right and they're thinking in the right direction. So if you've got 10 direct reports, and it's a Monday and you're kicking off the week, checking in. Hey, just checking in quick. Take 90 seconds. It doesn't have to be a long conference call. Now, those are good to have, by the way. I'm not saying you wouldn't have routine things scheduled, but a quick check-in call. What's on your mind? Anything I can help you with? What's your direction for the day? Now, you get them focused. They're focused on the right thing. Great things happen. And if you do that with all 10 of your people, it takes 15 minutes or so, and it could be throughout the whole day on that Monday. But that's the priority. And I always advise that anybody in a high leadership role, any leadership role at all, goes to their key players and to start the morning off, hey, just checking in. How do things look today? Anything I can help you with? What's on your mind? And when you talk about servant leader, that is very much servant leader. It's very different than a phone call that sounds like, hey, I'm calling to, follow up on you because I don't trust that you're doing things. That's a very different phone call. The spirit of that doesn't feel right. It feels like micromanagement. One of the things that I've learned is that you can talk to somebody more often than a micromanager, but with supportive content, and the person will never feel micromanaged. They'll feel supported. But a micromanager could literally talk to you once a week and just ask questions that make you feel, under a microscope. So it's the way the conversation flows, and are you providing some sort of a service to the people that you lead by being present to them at a particular time? So I'm going to summarize this by saying, when you're in leadership, make sure that you know the main thing. I'm going to summarize this again with a brief conversation. You call a salesperson and they're supposed to get 3 appointments a day, and you say, how does the day look? And they say I have some administration, and you say, okay, well, let's that's going to be important. I know you've got the administration, and since the administration always comes after your phone calls, let's get those phone calls done right away so you can get to that if it's on your mind. Okay? And you take away the excuse by telling them, instead of, administration's not important, you say, yes, that's important, so let's make sure we get the priority done first of getting your phone calls in, then get to administration. And there's really not much they can do about that. Or you say, how does the day look? And they know that they don't have the 3 appointments or 4 appointments they're supposed to have to meet their daily a goal. So they start distracting you by saying, hey, I have this one client, and they want to talk about this one client. And instead, you should bring them back to, how many appointments do you have today? And to get them focused on getting the bigger picture done before you get into the micro picture. Otherwise, they're using it as a distracting technique, and you don't even realize that they didn't get their 3 or 4 appointments that they're supposed to have because they have you talking about one particular client. All your time is used up with that. You call back the next day, they distract you again. You call back 2 weeks later, they distract you again, and you look at their reports and you're like, wow, you've only done 2 appointments in 3 weeks as opposed to 30 appointments or whatever the number is supposed to be. And you didn't even know it because they made it sound like they had this busy schedule because they were distracting you with a completely irrelevant thing in order to justify their low behavior. So what do? You get them focused on the thing that matters, and you give them self-management by giving them 3 assignments. Every single day, if you get these 3 things done on a daily basis in your routine, and those things would be very basic. They're kind of like what it means to be a human being. Okay, get up on time, go to bed on time, eat right, be healthy, kiss your wife, say your prayers, the basics, right? If you do these things, you live a good, healthy life. Well, when it comes to what you do in the workplace, that's also the same sort of thing.
No, it's very practical, and this is what I love about kind of the information that you give, Dave, is you do it in such a way where people tend to overcomplicate things and say, you need this, 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 and this, and this, and these types of morning routines, and this, and at the end of the day, it's very simplified. Keep the main thing, and these three things top of mind. Moving on to a separate topic here, Dave. As people of faith, we know that the ultimate creative is our creator. And we are all made in his image. And so oftentimes it's the case where people think that because they're not in the arts, they don't have an opportunity to be creative.
Yes.
But you've really highlighted the importance of not just innovation, but creativity in business. I'd love to touch on that a little bit and see how both in the business and in the workplace, people can use this gift, and maybe they don't think that they have it, but in reality they do. How have you found that to be the case in building your businesses?
Well, everybody is creative at different levels. Okay. Of course, God is the creator of all. So what's really interesting is that if we want to tap the greatest source of creativity, it is actually God. So are you cutting yourself off from him? Are you in the state of grace? If you're cutting yourself off from God, or you're simply not asking God, please fill this in me. So an interesting thing. My son, who I mentioned is a priest now, he's become quite a singer, and also his chanting is great. Like when he's in certain parts of the mass, I'm like, where did you learn to do that? You actually can sing and you can chant quite effectively. And he said, Dad, anyone can. He said, we're trained so much in this. He said and I don't remember what it was, but it was something like I don't know, maybe there was 100 people over a period of a couple of years. He said there's like 2 who sincerely couldn't do it. Like their voice just wouldn't make it happen. He said, but the rest of us just had to learn how to do it. And that's a pretty fascinating thing. When you think about our physical bodies, a lot of people think that they can't do something physically, but there are story after story after story of people at all different ages who have had absolutely radical physical transformations, or people who didn't know how to do something, weren't naturally inclined to a foreign language, and they find themselves in a foreign land, and all of a sudden they learn the language and they have it. All these things that we do learn when we put our efforts toward it, and we block these things with negative attitudes, and we block these things with these presuppositions or presumptions about ourselves that don't allow us to actually learn or grow. Creativity is one of those. Now, I would not claim for a moment that the highest level creative people are the same as everyone else. But what I would suggest, though, is that they have learned to tap into something that most people ignore in their life. Now, creativity is, in essence, joining 2 previously unjoined things. Okay? When somebody says that storyline wasn't creative, it's because it's been done before, many times over. The music wasn't creative. It's because it sounded the same as everything else. That design of that automobile wasn't creative because it looks like everything else. I've talked about this before, but a minivan was creative at first. There was just big vans. They decided to make a minivan. What is that? To create 2 things not previously joined. A van with a smaller size. How creative. Then the minivan had a door on one side, like most large vans, until they realized, wait a second, this is almost always used to get kids from soccer and buy groceries. We should have doors on both sides. Creative. And the minivans took off. The reason that I say this is because these are not profoundly massive things at all. Great. Take an item of great utility and make it smaller so that it's not just something that is used more in commercial use, but for family use. Okay, interesting. Hey, get out on both sides. Pretty simple. But these things are creative. So if we just stop and we say, what are the principles of creativity and how do we make it simple? Take 2 previously unjoined things and join them and see what happens. So what people don't realize is that people who are creative do this relentlessly and don't like the outcome. And then finally, they like the outcome. Let's combine these 2 things, whether it's music. Let's combine this melody with these lyrics or this beat or this whatever. Those things didn't match. Let's combine them again. Let's combine them again and again and again. And all of a sudden you have music that just sounds incredible because you've never heard it before. And of course, being creative, in essence, can create ugly things, but it can create beauty. And the artisan, the artist, the performer stops when it's beautiful. And an interesting thing about it is sometimes the beauty is in the weirdness of it. Like, there's something about that speaks to me in beauty because it is so off, but it's supposed to do that. Now, I'm not advocating for ugliness or weirdness for weirdness sake, but sometimes you see something that's beautiful that's off. In fact, this is just altogether beautiful, but the Pietà, okay, and I just recently saw this actually at St. Peter's. You know, our Blessed Mother is way bigger than Jesus, and that's just not, that's off. But what does it say? And that's the whole idea, is it says something. The David, again, you know, certain aspects of him, like his hand, these things that are just not proportionally the same as other things. But what does it mean? And when you see it and you go, that proportion is off, there must be something that it means. Or again, when you look at like the Last Judgment, okay, in the Sistine Chapel, this is like relatively dark and kind of scary in places. And yet the ugliness has a beauty to it. Why? Because it tells you an important story. And I think that the greatest artists, particularly in our Catholic faith, have been unafraid to show that side of things in order to provide contrast when we raise our hearts up and our minds up to God. You know, is interesting. I saw the Sagrada Familia. Tu familia que este? Yeah, did I say that right? Yeah. Are you familiar with this? And I'm just going to go on a personal editorial here, okay, in front of a Catholic audience, which really puts me at kind of judgment. But I was so disappointed when I got there. And I was so much looking forward to it because here it takes a couple hundred years to build this thing that's going to be finished next year. I walked in, and again, I need to do a little bit more research, but I'm just going to tell you what I saw. I saw a building that in its structure was so beautiful that it appears that by the time it got into the point where they were doing some of the interior decorating and design, it must have been the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the things that we see in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that make it look a little bit like Disney-ish were so present there that I was so uninspired. I was inspired by the height, tallest church in the world. I was inspired by the exterior design. And I just sat on a bench with my wife for a few minutes, and we just left and didn't even finish the tour. And you know where we went? We went to the cathedral in Naples that was built in the 1200s. And we couldn't leave. We were just so filled with awe, the beauty of it. Each one of the chapels, the stained glass. It was just, I guess if those churches didn't exist and I would have walked into the Sagrada Familia, I would have been like, wow, this is amazing. So I think just by contrast, knowing what these other amazing churches look like and how they raise your soul up. I mean, it's amazing. It was not nearly as tall, but it seemed taller. It seemed bigger. It seemed more eternal. And we went to Mass there twice when we were in Barcelona because of that. And it was, it's just, I guess, one of those things that when you look at art, it's not all the same. It's not all equal, but it raises your heart up a particular thing. So I took a little tangent there, but to come back to the summary of your question, for creativity, join two things that were not previously joined and be willing to take all sorts of risks along the way. And then at the end of the day, there's an objectivity about beauty. So people say that, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It is. That is very true. And there is a certain subjectivity about beauty, which gives us like the individual dimension that God provides. And that in itself is beautiful, by the way, right? But there's a universal understanding of beauty. There's a thing that says more people are attracted to this than are attracted to that because it is more universally beautiful. And quite often, people who are not attracted to the universally beautiful have just kind of been malformed in understanding what beauty actually is. And so, we talk about this just by way of food. There's good, really beautiful, amazing, nutritious, and rich and complex yet still simple food that chefs will spend all sorts of time bringing in the greatest ingredients around the world, and some people would just rather have a McDonald's burger. Okay, and why? Because we can train ourselves into things that are bad for us and even have an addiction to them, as opposed to educating and training ourselves into things that are good for us, that raise our heart, mind, and soul. And when we know the difference, we can see that contrast. And but to keep it simple, just do this. No matter who you are or whatever creative thing you're trying to do, take tons of risks and join two things that haven't been joined together. And I think you're going to find that outcome becomes pretty powerful.
Yeah, I love that, Dave. And to your point, I think that as you mature and grow in the spiritual life and just in life in general, you begin to appreciate certain things that before you're like, I thought that was kind of boring. Like classical music. I love listening to classical music. Ask me that 10 years ago, and I'm like, no, I like this type of music. And when I look back at that type of music, I'm like, it's so dissonant,
Yes. Yes.
And it's just interesting how you progress and how you grow in that area as well, and in business as well.
Yeah.
Moving on to a different topic here, Dave, and I think this is actually I read some article. I'm forgetting his name, but he's the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, and he said something to the effect of, I come across as not humble, but I know I'm humble because I talk to the CEO just like I talk to the janitor and vice versa, right? And so this question arises in a lot of people think that, either I'm too weak to lead, or I'm too nice to lead, and so the reality is they're too weak to lead, or I'm too humble to be in that position, but the reality is there's something else there. What's the balancing act between humility and confidence in leadership, and how you what sort of kind of misnomers or things that people falsely believe are present that prevent them from actually exhibiting confidence and think of it as humility?
Yeah. So okay, I want to, Nico, you're really going to have to bring me back to the origin of this question, because I have so many different departures I'm going to make that are relevant to this to set it up.
That's good. Okay.
So. One of the things that I think we should know as we enter into this conversation is that one of the greatest American, in fact, worldwide pastimes is to point out hypocrisy. And people like to point out hypocrisy sometimes, actually very rarely, because it is necessary and required in order to make a point and to identify maybe nefarious characters who are trying to be manipulative. But most of the time, that's not why they do it. Most of the time, people point out hypocrisy or a seeming hypocrisy to make themselves feel better. It's a look over there at that person thing, not at me. So they like to call people hypocrites, and leaders are among the highest level people that they'll do that to. So they say, well, you said you believe in servant leadership, but yet you hire entry-level employees that don't make as much as you as the CEO. How can you be a servant leader? Well, okay, that has literally nothing to do with it at all. And a servant leader is a leader of meritocracy. If you have the president of the United States answering the phone and taking out the garbage, how in the world can the president be making the decisions that are essential to run the largest economy in the world and the freest society and keep the world safe? I mean, you can't. Why? Oh, because they're being so nice that they're emptying the garbage and they're taking all the phone calls and doing the White House tours. That's not very nice. I mean, if your pilot on your airplane comes back and, asks if you want crackers while you're crashing because he's being a servant leader, he's entirely missing the point. But people do this sort of thing, and they do it because it makes them feel good. And there's all sorts of virtue signaling around the whole idea of what it means to lead or not lead. So the question you're asking is humility. How do we know we're being humble versus not being humble? Here's a little. What are they? It's called a hack, right? This is not a hack, but a hack is supposed to be something that's a simple way to get something bigger done in life that you hadn't thought of before. It's actually very much like creativity we talked about. I don't like the term hack in reference to what I'm about to say because it diminishes its glory and its awesomeness. But, oftentimes prayer is that. We're seeking all of our answers every other place. And if we just stop and directly ask God or a great saint who might have struggled through this sort of thing or is a patron to the type of thing that we're doing, we can eliminate all sorts of stuff and we get divine inspiration on something. So Our Lady of Sorrows is the best for this. And if we pray to Our Lady of Sorrows and we say, reveal to me where I have a deficiency in my my faith life or my life in general, then she will show that to us. And it is painful and it does hurt. And oftentimes it is centered around the aspects that we have in our life that are pride-filled, because at the core of all sin is pride. And so Our Lady of Sorrows, and one of the reasons I like to pray to Our Lady of Sorrows for this is, I'm just going to give you my personal experience here, is she's gentler. Our Blessed Mother is a mother, so she's not going to come to you and beat you over the head with where you have error, but she's going to show it to you just the same in its fullness, but she's going to do it gently. And so the very fact that we see it, that's what hurts. So she knows, and I'm speaking on Our Blessed Mother's behalf, but just in accordance to my relationship with her, she knows that I probably wouldn't be able to handle her being harsh with me and me recognizing all those failures that I have in my own life. The failures themselves are so weighty that I need her gentle introduction to them in order to manage them, because the weight of it would be, I think, too overwhelming. So I think when we look at it from that perspective, and we now have set the stage for a greater understanding of what it means to be in leadership and to be humble. Jesus was humble when he turned over the tables in the temple. Jesus was humble when he said, "You brood of vipers." Jesus was humble when he, when he did stand up to hypocrisy. Okay. Because humility is precision truth about ourselves, particularly in the eyes of God. And it is not a humble act to let bad behaviors take place within your organization. Now, just like the Blessed Mother is gentle, I know, with me in my own life, when I pray to her as Our Lady of Sorrows to introduce me to something that needs to be changed, we are better off in leadership positions being as gentle and kind as we possibly can according to the circumstance to provide light to the people that we're leading to make the change. Now, I wrote a book called Say It This Way, and it was actually called something else. It was called Say This, Not That. But there's a gentleman who wrote a book, Eat This, Not That, and like a million other things. And you can't actually trade. This is an interesting thing for the audience to know. You can't trademark intellectual property like that on a title. You can actually retitle a book the same as somebody else's book that was out there, unless you have at least a series of 3, and then you can title. You can actually. You can trademark the series. So he had Eat This, Not That, Dress This, or Wear This, Not That, everything. Even these books he's never planning on writing. They were very kind to me, and they said, you can sell the remaining copies you had in your first run, but you're going to have to retitle the book. It took like 13 years before I bothered because I was so busy, but we just did introduce and title that. But it's Say It This Way. Anyway, I remember criticism where somebody said, this gentleman doesn't know leadership because the book is constantly talking about being gentle and delicate around people's feelings, like he's tiptoeing. No, and I think anybody who's ever worked with me knows that there is a limit to the tiptoeing. But if those things are coming out often, you're just leading the wrong way. I mean, if you're really a great leader, there shouldn't be a lot of conflict. And if you're a really great leader, there's usually a kind way of making a change and movement for somebody, because retention is primarily the effect for long-term growth. I mean, if you're going to invest into a team, teach them, train them, teach them culture, and have them work well, and now they make a mistake, and you just like hammer them, first of all, it runs against a good culture, and second of all, it inclines them to want to not be a part of it anymore. And third of all, the people who see you treat that person that way now feel a little the same injustice. In fact, most people in companies that feel injustice did not directly feel it, but saw somebody else go through it and are worried that it's about their turn, that it's going to be their turn at some point. So that's the same about most things that people have actually in fear. I saw somebody else go through this. Now I'm afraid of it. I know somebody that died of a heart attack. I think I might die of one. I know somebody that had died in a motorcycle accident. Therefore, I'll never drive one. All these different types of things. So cultures are the same way. So when we treat people with a dignity and we've invested so much into them, then we generally want them to stay because they've learned way more than the deficit that they have. So usually it's patterns on that sort of thing, or if it's a big time nefarious behavior that requires intensity in correction, it needs to take place too. That is also humility. It is not fearing and entering into through fortitude, which is like suffering well, right? To know how to suffer well. To know how to suffer well, it literally includes battle. In fact, ultimately speaking, fortitude is the willingness to die. That's what it means to suffer well. So a lot of the battles that we have are being unafraid of entering into the conversation to help a person make change that needs to be made for their good, the good of others, and the good of the organization. And if you know that you say, oh, I was wondering if you might maybe possibly make a move on that, and that's not going to work, because this person doesn't respect that. They don't see that as power or strength. And you need to come in and use your voice that actually matters to get the job done. And if it's necessary to put an actual consequence there and to make that consequence known with that particular person, and now good comes from it, I found that most of the people, whenever I've had to do that in my life, are grateful for it. And they feel in a certain way protected because there's clarity of thinking. It's not confusing. See, before that moment when they're acting nefariously, they know they're doing something wrong, and they know that there's probably going to be a consequence, and they would expect that consequence in a strong leader to be a certain thing. And if you come in and you have this all sorts of weakness around you, that doesn't work very well. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a certain amount of mercy and empathy in a circumstance. So, for example, you find out the circumstance, you go to the person, you mention it before it's elevated, and that person is completely contrite, and all of your intuition says, you know they made a certain mistake. This is not a time to hammer them. This is a time to just let the natural consequence take place. But if you point out all of the error and you show them, and you've got video and recordings and everything else that demonstrate exactly what they did, and they basically deny its existence, and you now elevate this a little bit, and I'm not saying it's elevated necessarily in voice or language or choice of words in a harmful way, but I mean in the consequence of the circumstance and what is about to take place. In fact, sometimes no words at all and a particular look, but with a definite outcome, that matters a lot. And we do actually have to remember that suffering well includes our willingness to go to battle for what is good, right, and true.